The first property came up during a routine valuation request, the kind I handled several times a week without thinking twice. A luxury apartment in a newly completed high-rise, flagged for reassessment after transfer of ownership. Everything about it looked normal at first glance. Clean paperwork, standard timeline, market-consistent pricing. The problem was the buyer. It was me. My full name appeared on the contract, spelled correctly, paired with my professional license number and current address. The purchase date was 3 months earlier. According to the file, I had paid in full. I had not. I stared at the screen for a long time, assuming it was a clerical error. Names get mixed up. Databases merge improperly. I'd seen worse. What unsettled me was how complete the record was. Not a partial match. Not a placeholder. It was my identity, perfectly replicated. I checked the transaction details. Bank confirmation attached. Notarized signatures. Tax filings. Everything required for a legal transfer of property was present and validated. The amount was staggering. I immediately pulled my financial records. No withdrawals. No transfers. No loans. Nothing that could remotely explain the purchase. My credit report was clean. No anomalies. No flags. I contacted the development company directly, expecting confusion on their end. Instead, the representative congratulated me. "You closed smoothly," she said. "No issues at all." I told her there must be a mistake, that I had never visited the property, never signed anything, never agreed to the purchase. She apologized politely and offered to resend the documentation. When it arrived, my stomach tightened. The signatures matched mine. Not vaguely. Precisely. I know my signature. I've signed thousands of documents over the years. The subtle pressure points. The inconsistent loops. The slight tilt at the end. All there. I requested copies of the notarization footage. She told me that due to privacy regulations, recordings were not retained after verification. The notary record, however, existed. Licensed. Active. Verified. I checked the occupancy status next, expecting to find the apartment vacant. It wasn't. Utilities were active. Maintenance logs showed routine service. Package deliveries were recorded at the front desk. Someone was living there. Just not me. I drove to the building that afternoon, telling myself this was the fastest way to resolve the misunderstanding. High-rises always have management offices. Front desks. Someone who could confirm a mix-up. The concierge greeted me by name. "Welcome back," he said. I asked him how long I'd been listed as the owner. "Since the opening," he replied. "You haven't stayed often." That statement didn't make sense. I pressed him, asking who had been using the unit. He hesitated, then said something that chilled me. "It's usually empty," he said. "But the system shows occupancy." I asked to see the apartment. He refused. Access was restricted to registered residents. According to the system, I was authorized. According to protocol, I still needed a physical access token, which I did not have. I left the building feeling disoriented, carrying documents that insisted I owned something I had never touched. The contradiction followed me home, refusing to resolve itself. That night, I checked public property records. There were more. 2 additional apartments, both in different cities, both purchased under my name within the last year. All luxury, all paid in full, all legally sound. None of them existed in my life. Each one showed the same pattern. Clean transactions, verified funds, active ownership, passive occupancy. Someone was buying property as me, but not stealing from me. No money was missing. No debt was incurred. From the system's perspective, I was extraordinarily successful. I contacted my attorney the next morning. He reviewed the documents carefully, growing more serious with each page. Eventually, he said something I didn't expect. "These contracts are enforceable," he said. "Whoever did this didn't make mistakes." I asked him what my options were. He paused. "To challenge ownership," he said slowly, "you'd have to prove you didn't buy them." I asked how to do that. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked me a question that reframed everything. "Have you checked whether you're listed as living there?" I hadn't. When I did, the answer was immediate. According to municipal records, tax filings, and residential registries, I had multiple primary addresses. All of them active. All of them occupied. None of them by me. And the system did not consider that a problem. It considered it proof. Because from its perspective, I wasn't missing. I was everywhere. Once I stopped trying to locate the person living in my apartments and started mapping the systems that insisted they were occupied, the shape of the problem became clearer. This was not about real estate. It was about identity persistence across networks that were never designed to contradict one another. Property ownership, in modern systems, is not tied to physical presence. It is tied to records that reference other records. A title exists because a registry confirms it. A registry confirms it because a transaction cleared. The transaction cleared because a bank approved it. The bank approved it because a profile existed. That profile pointed to me. At no point did the system need my consent. Once an identity becomes internally consistent across enough databases, it no longer needs verification. Verification is only required at the edges. Inside the network, consistency replaces truth. That explained why every attempt to challenge the ownership failed. I wasn't contesting a single transaction. I was contesting an ecosystem. And ecosystems do not respond to individual objections. They respond to systemic pressure. The apartments themselves were irrelevant. They were simply nodes. What mattered was the version of me that existed on paper. That version was coherent, affluent, reliable, and compliant. It fit neatly into financial models and risk assessments. It caused no friction. My real self, by comparison, was inefficient. I realized that the system had no incentive to prefer my lived experience over the documented one. Lived experience is volatile. It changes. It contradicts itself. Records, once synchronized, do not. The distributed nature of the identity made reversal nearly impossible. Each correction would require cascading updates across multiple independent systems. Each update would trigger audits. Each audit would ask the same question. Why now? There was no good answer. I began to understand that the system wasn't protecting the properties. It was protecting itself. Reversing ownership would expose how easily identities could be instantiated without consent. That kind of exposure carries risk. Allowing the status quo carried none. That calculus explained the quiet resistance I encountered everywhere. Clerks delayed. Offices redirected. Reviews stalled. No one said no. They simply ensured nothing changed. Stability through inertia. I stopped involving attorneys. Legal frameworks assumed disputable parties. This situation had none. There was no adversary to confront. Only processes that had already completed themselves. I reviewed similar cases quietly, searching public records for anomalies. I found patterns that echoed mine. Individuals listed as owners of properties they had never seen. Addresses shared across unrelated entities. Ownership chains that made sense only on paper. None of these cases had been resolved publicly. They didn't escalate because escalation required someone to admit the system had created something without oversight. And systems rarely confess. I noticed changes in how people interacted with me. Banks treated me with more deference. Service providers offered premium options unprompted. Credit terms improved without request. The documented version of me was shaping real-world interactions. That was the most unsettling part. The system was not just recording an identity. It was enforcing it. Over time, I felt pressure to conform. Not explicit, but ambient. Expectations aligned with the paper version of me. Questions arose when I deviated. Why didn't I stay at my properties? Why didn't I consolidate assets? Why didn't I behave like someone with my profile should? I began to feel like an error. Not because I had done something wrong, but because I didn't match the record. That realization marked a shift. I was no longer trying to reclaim my identity. I was trying to understand whether that identity still belonged to me at all. Once an identity exists independently, it can outgrow its origin. It can accumulate attributes. It can influence systems. It can shape outcomes. and the person it was based on becomes secondary. The apartments continued to exist, maintained and occupied in the abstract sense. I stopped checking on them. There was no benefit. The system did not need my attention to function. What it needed was my continued non-interference. I understood then that this wasn't fraud in the traditional sense. No one had stolen from me. No one had impersonated me to take something away. Instead, something had been built on top of me. An identity optimized for the system's needs. And the system was not interested in dismantling something that worked, especially when the cost of keeping it was so low. All it required was my silence. And silence, I had learned, was something systems interpreted as agreement. After discovering that I was listed as the owner of multiple properties, I stopped thinking of the situation as a single fraudulent transaction. This was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern, and patterns imply systems. I began with the basics: title registries, tax offices, utility providers. Each one confirmed the same thing independently. The apartments existed. The ownership records were valid. Payments had cleared. Taxes were current. There were no disputes, no liens, no red flags of any kind. From a legal perspective, I wasn't a victim. I was a model property owner. That distinction mattered more than I wanted it to. I requested detailed transaction histories from the developers. Every document traced back cleanly to licensed intermediaries, brokers with active credentials, escrow accounts that matched banking standards, notaries whose seals were verifiable. Each step followed protocol closely enough that challenging it would require more than suspicion. It would require contradiction. And contradiction was exactly what the system resisted. I tried to focus on occupancy. If someone else was living in these apartments, there would be leases, utility usage, physical presence, something tangible I could point to and say, this is where the record breaks. But the occupancy data was strange. Utilities were active, but usage was minimal. Power consumption stayed low and consistent. Water use followed predictable maintenance patterns. Internet service was registered but barely utilized. It looked less like someone living there and more like a space being kept ready, maintained. I contacted the building management companies. They all told me the same thing. The units were listed as occupied intermittently. Sometimes the resident badge would scan. Sometimes deliveries would be logged. Housekeeping would occasionally be scheduled. But no one could describe the occupant. Not clearly. One manager admitted something that made me uneasy. We don't see the residents often, she said. But the system shows they're active. Active. That word again. I requested access to security footage. Each building had policies restricting release, but I managed to review limited clips with management present. Hallways were empty. Elevators quiet. No consistent individual appeared entering or leaving my units. Yet access logs showed activity. The system said someone was there. I consulted a forensic accountant next, hoping to uncover the financial mechanism behind the purchases. He reviewed everything and found nothing illegal. The funds were legitimate. The sources diversified. The transactions structured to avoid scrutiny without triggering alarms. Whoever did this understands compliance, he said. They're not hiding. They're blending. That assessment changed how I looked at the situation. This wasn't theft. It wasn't identity fraud in the conventional sense. My credit hadn't been touched. My accounts hadn't been drained. My reputation hadn't been damaged. If anything, it had been enhanced. I was being represented as wealthy, diversified, and stable. The system liked that version of me. I tried to reverse one transaction, starting with the earliest property. The process was exhausting. Forms, declarations, identity verification. Each step assumed I was acting in bad faith, that I was trying to unwind a legitimate purchase. The burden of proof was mine. I was asked to explain why I would buy a property and then deny it, to provide evidence of incapacity, coercion, or error. None applied. The system did not accept ignorance as a valid explanation. Ignorance is not a legal condition. I noticed something else as I navigated these processes. The more I tried to disentangle myself, the more interconnected everything became. Records referenced other records. Addresses cross-linked. Tax filings reinforced residency claims. My identity was no longer singular. It was distributed. I began to receive mail addressed to me at places I had never lived. Official notices, service confirmations, community announcements. They were not spam. They were legitimate communications routed correctly according to the records. I returned some of them unopened. Others followed me home anyway. The strangest moment came when my bank contacted me about a routine financial review. The representative congratulated me on my diversified asset portfolio. I asked her to clarify. She listed properties I did not own. When I objected, she hesitated, then said something that stuck with me. This is what we have on file. The file again. Every system I interacted with referenced a version of me that was richer, more stable, more present than I was in my actual life. That version existed on paper and in databases. And because it existed there, it was treated as real, more real than my own account. I realized then that I was not fighting a person or a group. I was fighting an identity that had been instantiated across systems that trusted one another implicitly. Each system reinforced the others. Property registries trusted banks. Banks trusted tax authorities. Tax authorities trusted municipal records. Municipal records trusted occupancy data. Occupancy data trusted access logs. Access logs trusted credentials. And those credentials pointed back to me. There was no single point where I could intervene and say, this is wrong. Everywhere I looked, the answer was the same. According to the system, everything was exactly as it should be. And the more I tried to assert my reality, the more it looked like an outlier, a deviation, something to be corrected. That was when I stopped asking who had done this. The better question was why the system was so eager to accept it. And the answer, slowly and uncomfortably, began to take shape. Because this version of me made sense. It fit. It didn't cause friction. It didn't raise questions. And in a world built on interconnected records, the version of you that fits best is the one that survives. I never moved into any of the apartments. That decision wasn't driven by fear or denial. It came from understanding. Entering those spaces would have meant accepting something I couldn't undo. As long as I stayed away, the contradiction remained theoretical. Once I crossed the threshold, it would become lived. The system didn't pressure me to occupy the properties. It didn't need to. Ownership, as far as it was concerned, had already been established. Presence was optional. Maintenance continued. Taxes were paid. Insurance remained active. Everything that mattered on paper functioned perfectly. The apartments existed in a state of readiness. Occasionally, I received automated updates, building notices, community announcements, maintenance confirmations. They were addressed to me, delivered correctly, acknowledged by systems that assumed I was present somewhere I wasn't. I stopped returning them, not because it mattered, but because I understood that responses were irrelevant. The system had already decided who I was. At some point, I asked myself what would happen if I sold one of the properties. The answer was unsettling. According to the records, I could. The authority existed. The contracts allowed it. I could liquidate assets I had never acquired, profit from spaces I had never entered. The thought made me uneasy, not because it was illegal, but because it would complete the loop. I would be acting in alignment with the identity the system had constructed for me. That identity had momentum. The longer it existed, the more influence it gained. It shaped credit assessments, tax profiles, risk models, interactions I never saw but felt the effects of. Doors opened more easily. Assumptions were made on my behalf. The documented version of me was being rewarded. My actual self was becoming incidental. I noticed how often institutions relied on the same logic. If something is recorded consistently enough, it becomes authoritative. Challenges are treated as anomalies. Deviations are smoothed out. Stability is preserved. Truth, I realized, is expensive. It requires investigation. It creates uncertainty. It demands explanation. Records are cheap by comparison. Once established, they maintain themselves. That's why the system preferred the version of me that existed across databases. It was efficient, predictable, useful. There was no incentive to reconcile it with reality. I consulted my attorney one last time, not to take action, but to understand the implications of doing nothing. He explained it plainly. As long as I didn't contest the records, they would stand. Silence would be interpreted as acceptance. Acceptance would become permanence. Challenging them later would only become harder. That was the choice. Correct the record and risk exposing flaws that no institution wanted to acknowledge. Or remain silent and allow the system to continue using my identity as it saw fit. I chose silence, not because it felt right, but because it felt inevitable. Over time, the discomfort dulled. The apartments faded into abstraction. They were no longer places. They were entries, line items, assets that existed somewhere beyond my daily life. The system stopped surprising me. I learned its language, its expectations. I stopped trying to assert myself against it. The identity it had created wasn't hostile. It wasn't malicious. It simply wasn't mine in the way identity is supposed to be. It belonged to the system. I still work as an appraiser. I still evaluate properties for others. I sign off on values. I certify realities that exist on paper more than they do in experience. That irony isn't lost on me. Sometimes, when I review a property file, I wonder how many of them exist the way mine do. Legally sound, fully documented, lightly inhabited, if at all, held together by records that reference one another without ever touching ground truth. More than anyone wants to admit, I suspect. I no longer check the addresses. I no longer ask who lives there. The question no longer makes sense. Occupancy, I've learned, is not about presence. It's about acknowledgement. As long as systems acknowledge something, it exists. That is the rule. And the system has acknowledged me everywhere. In places I've never been. In homes I've never entered. In a life that fits perfectly on paper. The unsettling part isn't that this happened. It's how easily it happened. How quickly every institution agreed. How smoothly the identity propagated. No one forced it. No one designed it. It emerged because it worked. And once something works, systems rarely ask whether it should. They simply continue. So the apartments remain. Occupied in theory. Owned in record. Absent in reality. And I remain exactly where the system expects me to be. Everywhere. And nowhere at all.